It's kind of crazy to think that as recently as 30 years ago, if you wanted to make beer in your home, you'd have to break the law. Thankfully, in 1978, it became legal on the federal level for people to homebrew, but unfortunately, this didn't include everyone, as certain states continued to restrict this natural right. But this all ended in 2013 when the last two holdouts, Mississippi and Alabama, passed laws making it okay for people to make beer at home. For the first time since Prohibition, it was legal to homebrew in all 50 of the United States. This was due in large part to the dedication and hard work of the American Homebrewers Association. In addition to continuing the fight for our right to brew, they're committed to growing the hobby by coordinating events such as Big Brew for National Homebrew Day and HomebrewCon. We're proud to say that the Brewlosophy podcast is brought to you by the American Homebrewers Association and encourage all of our listeners to support the organization that has done so much for this hobby by becoming a member today.
Playing a leading role in styles like stout, porter, and brown ale, roasted grains impart a range of flavors. Toasty, nutty, and chocolatey, all the way to coffee-like and even ashy. When used with a deft touch, these generally characterful grains play an integral role not only in producing the appropriate flavor profiles for less roast-forward styles, but they're also an important factor when it comes to color. You're listening to the Brewlosophy podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and contributor Matt Del Fiacco is with me today to talk about this lovely ingredient, its history, uses, and of course, some experiments that we've done on roasted grains. Matt, as a huge fan of Imperial Stout and other big, rich, dark beers, I'm sure you've got plenty of experience using roasted grains.
I do, probably more than anything else besides base grains. I mean, roasted malts have been a huge part of my brewing experience just from the very beginning, where I was trying to make Guinness clones all the way to yesterday, and I made an Imperial Stout. So I love roasted grains. They are probably one of my favorite.
Yeah, it's funny because we live in this super hop centric world of brewing right now, and yeah. As much as you hear talk about kind of craft beer dying out or the bubble not bursting but not growing anymore, hoppy beer is still kind of leading the charge, and that's what people look for. But the reality is, man, a lot of these dark beers were really what made. They were kind of the intro for a lot of people into craft beer. They were kind of some of the first styles that were different than just pale, pallid lagers, back in the day. And they don't get as much love as they should for people, who love this style, or these darker styles like you and me.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, I think part of it might just be that, when you come into beer, I think we all have this expectation of what a beer is going to be, what a beer is going to taste like. And if you go in with, an American porter or something, those are definitely maybe not quite as a one-to-one comparison of what you think of. So most people maybe shy away from it initially. But Guinness is a fairly accessible dark beer that I think a lot of people start drinking early on, or at least try. It's at least, most bars in America. And
Guinness is, that's got to be the most quintessential, most recognizable, stout out there.
Definitely.
And if you tell someone, hey, name a dark beer for me, I think Guinness is going to be the first one. And for good reason. They kind of defined dark beer in America, at least. I think there's a lot of history behind how they developed the roasted grain and how they started making their products. So, for good reason, I think.
Yeah, I agree entirely. But that said, there's a lot out there, the huge range of profiles from the dry stouts to Imperial Stouts to Schwartz beers to Czech dark lagers. We don't need to narrow ourselves to just, these dark things. Dark roasted malts are used in a huge variety of styles, accessible for tons of different palates, tons of different flavor preferences. So there's room for it. I think in anyone's brewing repertoire, you can use some roasted malts for sure.
Absolutely. Even if you're just doing it for color correction or to add that particular red color to beers like Irish Red Ale. Just a tiny little dose of some roasted barley can get you there. Well, I've certainly used my fair share of roasted grains and have some anecdotal conclusions on differences between different types of grain and the methods used for getting those roasted flavors into your beer, all of which we're going to be digging into in just a bit. So just a couple days ago, one of the biggest names in homebrewing, John Palmer, author of How to Brew, Brewing Classic Styles, and the Water Book, sat down for an hour with patrons of Brewlosophy to answer questions they lobbed at him. It was amazing. The video of this event is still up on our private Facebook page and will be available to all new patrons who weren't able to make the event. If you want to be a part of future Q&A livecasts, you can head over to patreon.com/brewlosophy to sign up. And if you get in before the end of March, you're going to be able to ask questions of BJCP Grandmaster Judge and homebrewing legend Gordon Strong, really good guy. We also have other levels with rewards, including private Brewlosophy recipes, unique discounts to Yakima Valley hops, the opportunity to join us in a monthly video chat, and more. Go check it out at patreon.com/brewlosophy. If you head over to brewlosophy.com/support, you're going to find a list of links to bookmark and use whenever you do your shopping online. You won't feel a thing, and we get a little kickback that helps us to continue bringing you this content. Also, don't forget to subscribe to this podcast, and please leave a rating and a review. That feedback is super helpful, and those ratings help people who don't currently know about us find us. So that's a good thing. Thanks to the nearly 200 people who've already done this. We really do appreciate it. So Matt, we're just 3 months away from my favorite event of the year, HomebrewCon. The Brewlosophy crew is going to be heading to Portland for 3 days of beer and brewing mania, and we hope to see you there. You and I, Matt, are going to be joining our friend Chino Sachin in a seminar on brewing beer quickly. And of course, we'll be recording some episodes. In fact, we just settled on what we'll be recording. It's going to be super fun. In addition to a few live Jersey and Tim beer review sessions, which everyone attending will have the opportunity to have their beer reviewed by Jersey and Tim. And we'll be releasing details on how to get signed up for that shortly. But we're also going to be recording a live Brew&A episode, fielding questions with our friends from Yakima Valley Hops, Mecca Great Estate Malt, and Imperial Yeast from attendees on the expo floor. Should be really cool. Make sure to go register now for HomebrewCon. Bite the bullet. You won't regret it. I promise you. It's the funnest thing you can do all year in homebrewing. And don't forget, you have to be an AHA member to attend. You can sign up for that at brewlosophy.com/AHA or homebrewersassociation.org. Also, just to let you know, the Brewlosophy crew is going to be heading into town early. The evening of June 27th, we're going to be attending Imperial Yeast's event, Insane in the Yeast Strain. It's a free event. You just have to pay for your beer. They're going to have 12 beers made from the same base wort and inoculated with different yeast strains. So I think it's going to be super cool to kind of compare these different beers. But feel free to stop by. It's going to be at Imperial Bottle Shop on Division Street in downtown Portland.
Man, I can't wait. I'm after listening to the podcast where we had the Imperial guys on. I'm so pumped to try some different beers with them. Just hear about their experience with those strains and see how those base worts are different. And then every year, the HomebrewCon is the greatest event. Just so tons of people come together, have some beer, sing some karaoke. It's going to be great.
We'll be releasing details on our karaoke event shortly. But yeah, people, the thing about brewing in general, it's just a cool environment. The people who are into brewing and homebrewing are just generally, I can't speak for everyone, but they're generally just cool. And you think of the folks from Yakima Valley Hops and Imperial Yeast and Mecca Grade. I've spent time with all these dudes, and they're they're the people you want to be hanging out with. They're super fun. I'm stoked as well. Yeah. Well, we've got some feedback, which this week is brought to you by Brewers Hardware, who specialize in tri-clover compatible sanitary fittings, conical fermenters, kettles, and brew stands. Brewers Hardware offers a variety of unique and hard to find items for both the home and craft brewing markets, including high-quality stainless fittings at competitive prices and very fast shipping. I've been using their quick clean take-apart ball valves for a few years now. They're super easy to clean and just a really cool product. Brewers Hardware is also stoked to announce the release of the BCS 482, the newest in brewery automation. To learn more about this and all of the other gear they sell, you can head over to brewershardware.com, and don't forget to mention Brewlosophy at checkout to receive a free gift. That's brewershardware.com. Okay, feedback this week is pretty general, so we should be able to kind of blast through this one. From sure. John Perth via email, I've heard you talk about new t-shirts coming out soon, but all I'm seeing are the ones on Amazon. Just wondering when I'll be able to get my hands on the new stuff. Okay, John, and everyone else who's curious about this. Our new shirts are for sale at YakimaValleyHops.com right now. We've got three options right now. One of them is a brand new design that I'm loving. We're calling it the Think Beer design. Go to YakimaValleyHops.com and either search for Brewlosophy, or if you go into their merch section, there's a Brewlosophy link as well, and you can go check that out. We don't have anything but those 3 t-shirts at this point, but we're working on all kinds of ideas and to kind of fill that store up. It's going to be really cool. If you were on our newsletter, The Hop Beat, you would have known this already because we sent out a newsletter, a week and a half or so ago, informing people about this. So they kind of had first dibs on getting those shirts. They're selling quickly. So we're going to be placing some more orders. And like I said, there will be more merch in there relatively soon, hopefully. And we're going to have some merch with us at HomebrewCon as well for people to pick up. And then finally, a lot of people have been asking me this one. We get this kind of on a daily basis. Where can we make experiment suggestions? Well, you can make suggestions wherever you like. We do consider most of the ones that come in, but the truth is we have a pretty lengthy list of upcoming experiments. And with rare exception, most of the suggestions we receive are kind of already on that list. If you're really dying to see a certain experiment done and you just want it done right away, probably the best way to do that, to get it moved to the top of the list, is by pledging over at Patreon. We have a level, it's our top level, where you get to work privately with a contributor to develop an experiment of your choosing. So other than that, you can send them to us and we will add, the ideas to the list if they're not already on there. You can send them to feedback@brewlosophy.com. You can send them to Marshall@brewlosophy.com, drop them on our social media, wherever. But that's the best way to do it. We have a pretty set schedule. I'm kind of neurotic about that. And so we kind of go by that more than we do recommendations at this point. So it was probably 4 or 5 years ago that I started to notice what seemed to be a pretty meteoric rise in the popularity of funky and sour beers. My local brewing friends and I all at least dabbled in a little, making these beers fermented with Brettanomyces and other microbes. And while I've tended to stick primarily to making cleaner styles, I certainly enjoy a nice funky beer from time to time. Well, homebrewer Jeremy Barr recently sent me a very interesting beer that he calls Machine Gun Funk, which was fermented with Brettanomyces, and I was pretty sure would be a completely novel experience for my buddies.
1 minute beer review with Jersey and Tim.
Oh, it's light and cloudy. There's nothing I'm drawing a blank. Whoa, it's pungent. Stings the nostrils in a good way. I don't know, man. You're frowning. Is it a happy frown?
See what you think.
No, I want to watch you first. This is the funniest part.
I'm not liking this one.
You don't like anything. Whoa. Oh, dude, this is something like fancy.
Yeah.
We're supposed to know about this.
Oh, I know nothing about this. A little apricotish.
There's something going on. It's obviously a beer.
The more I drink it, I'm able to keep drinking it.
Well, that's how this always works. We warm up to them.
Yeah.
If you drink enough of it, you're going to like it all.
I don't like it, though.
I kind of.
Well, you go with it.
I'm going to take my own path on this one, man. I kind of like it. It's just in a weird way.
Sit back and watch.
In a weird way. There's some weird shit going on in there. There's like 2 different beers. There's the one you drink and there's the one that shows up afterwards. I'm like, hey, this is. Oh, hey, whoa, hey, who invited you?
Yeah.
It's interesting. We don't have
the capability of.
We don't have the beer vocabulary to describe what we're tasting, but we're drinking it.
Yeah,
you're almost done.
I'm almost done with it. I'm trying to figure it out. I got nothing.
Well, we know 2 styles: Miller Lite and IPAs. It's not either of those. It's something different and new that we've never even heard about.
This is a double IPA fermented with Brettanomyces, a wild yeast strain, double dry hopped, and then aged on kiwi puree and gin-infused oak staves.
No, Brettanomyces. I knew there was some Brettanomyces.
I almost had that.
No, I have no idea what this is.
Idea.
It's something weird, man.
I said apricot-y kind of.
Why don't you pat yourself on the back there, buddy?
I don't like it.
Yeah, you stuck it.
The beer was definitely an IPA, and I loved the fact that Jersey was able to kind of notice the layers in the beer. At least that's what my impression is based on his statement that, it tasted like 2 beers in one.
Definitely. And I mean, like when he was mentioning that he, maybe he didn't have the beer vocabulary, or, he says that a couple times. That's a really great description, that it was 2 beers, that he got something in the aftertaste that wasn't there. I thought it was a great description.
Yeah.
I think you said that beer was fermented in primary with Brett.
That's the impression I got based on what the information Jeremy sent me. And in my opinion, this beer was really well made. I'm not really a big fan of gin at all, and so I was a little wary of the fact that this beer was aged on gin-soaked oak. But it really worked out nicely. The Brett flavor stole the show. I didn't perceive much in the way of a kiwi character, but that could have been maybe what played into some of that, that just kind of complexity of the beer. I did pick up just a whisper of THP, that sort of Captain Crunch or Cheerios thing.
Oh, sure.
that can happen in funky beers, but I didn't think it was all that offensive. So I mean, I don't know if I could drink a whole pint of that stuff. There was so much going on, but Jeremy, good job. Thank you for sending that. If anyone out there wants their beer or any other fermented beverage reviewed on the Jersey and Tim beer review, go ahead and shoot me an email, marshall@brewlosophy.com, and we will get you all set up. All right, Roasted Grain is the name of the game when we return from these brief messages.
As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com, and be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you. Shopping for brewing supplies online can be a real hassle, which is why we recommend Love to Brew. They've got great prices, super fast shipping, and they carry exclusive products like East Coast Yeast, the Brewer's Essentials brand, and their award-winning beer recipe kits. They're also the only place you can pick up your very own Brewlosophy recipe kit. The numbers don't lie. Love to Brew has hundreds of 5-star reviews, and thousands of brewers are choosing them for their supplies and ingredients each year. Experience the difference at lovetobrew.com. That's love, the number 2, brew.com. Founded in 1978 by brewing pioneer Charlie Papazian, the American Homebrewers Association is a division of the Brewers Association focused specifically on protecting and promoting the hobby of homebrewing. In addition to their work lobbying for the rights of homebrewers across the country, they're also the primary sponsor of Brewlosophy.com. By joining the AHA, not only are you supporting their cause, but you get a ton of benefits as well. Discounts at breweries across the U.S., early access to tickets for events like the Great American Beer Festival, and you get to attend HomebrewCon, the world's biggest gathering of homebrewers. Head over to Brewlosophy.com/AHA now to sign up to become a member.
Dark, rich, ashy, coffee, chocolate, all descriptors of a general set of ingredients that have served to define certain styles of beer.
So roasted grains and roasted malts specifically have been around for an incredibly long time, at least as early as the early 1800s, possibly earlier. So thinking about like the history, one of the things I want to establish really early on is that while we're talking about roasted malts and we're using that kind of terminology, some of the classic types of roasted malt are actually not malts specifically. If we think about something like black or roasted barley, like that doesn't actually undergo a malting process. And we'll talk a little bit about that in the production of roasted malts too. But
yeah, I have a tendency, because of that, I kind of have a tendency to refer to any dark grain as just grain and not malt. It's one of those things, because I know roasted barley is the perfect example. It's actually not a malted grain. It's not a malted barley.
That is definitely, I think, the safer option when we're talking about this. So we can say that as well. We can say roasted grains, but I mean, they've been around for a really long time. They have a pretty well established history. One of the things I'm going to defer to on this is that Ron Pattinson actually cites The Theory of Practice in Brewing. It's a book from W.L. Tizard from 1846. And Tizard makes the comment that the use of coloring in beer was made illegal in 1816. And, like so much of beer history is shaped by taxes and by laws. Like a lot of things that we think are like, oh, the brewers knew that this was going to be better in the long run. Like maybe kind of not. Like it was taxes. And it was the use of like, oh, well, maybe bakers also needed grain.
Yeah.
But in this specific instance, coloring was made illegal, and Daniel Wheeler found a solution to making darker beers, which were incredibly popular at the time, like we talked about briefly. Like, we know them now as porters, for making dark beers by roasting the malt that he had, like a pale malt, in a drum, like coffee beans. And when Wheeler then patented that malt, hence the name Black Patent. So when we talk about like Black Patent malt, it's because it was the black malt that was patented by Daniel Wheeler in 1816.
So then this is new to me. It sounds like brewers were using other forms of colorant to impart different colors to their beer. I haven't like read up too much on the history of dark beers, I guess, but are you aware of what they were using, of what they were using to adjust the color of their beer prior to Black Patent? I mean, I always just assumed those beers were pale, you know.
Really early instances we have of coloring being used is actually brewer's caramel. So this would be like a sugar product that undergoes, a very aggressive boil down with the reactions, and it's essentially a syrup that colors beer. Now, also something to keep in mind when we talk about like porters and stuff, we can actually even look back a little bit in the historical BJCP guidelines that exist now. Black beers today and dark beers today are not the same dark beers that existed in 1815. Those beers were likely lighter in color. Especially, there's even some things like Scottish heavies and Scottish lights, which used brewer's caramel in order to get maybe an amber or like maybe a brown, like a brown color, as opposed to like some of the stouts we see today.
Right. That's interesting. The history of where this came from. I do. You read a lot about in beer history in general how taxes really did kind of form or kind of shape these different styles that we now view as completely normal.
Oh yeah.
So it's fascinating stuff. Well, let's talk a little bit about how these different types of roasted malts or roasted grains are made.
Yes.
There are a few. You talked about Black Patent. Of course, there's roasted barley. We've got chocolate malt. How exactly are these produced?
So basically what happens is some of them, like chocolate malt or even things like brown malt, like that is, roasted malt is a pretty wide term.
There's a ton of different roasted grains. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. But so during their production, and let's stick with malts for now, it goes through the germination process like any barley normally would. And then that barley undergoes a heating process, like a really intense heating process in a drum. And as it is rotated, and as it, goes through that pretty uniform heating process, as opposed to something like a crystal malt where it's not in a drum, like it's maybe that kilning process doesn't have as much agitation. It may not be as uniform. But that roasting process that takes place in a drum increases and darkens that beer, or darkens that malt. So as more intense heat, like pretty high intense heat over a short period of time is applied, the malt undergoes a lot of reactions, and even especially in the husk undergoes a lot of reactions to darken the malt, and it ends up passing through different phases of the lava bond. As grains get darker, there's actually a fairly linear relationship between lava bond and diastatic power, the ability for a malt to convert sugars. And David Richter from Brees has noted in presentations that once we're around like 30 lava bond, we actually have not a lot of diastatic power left. So especially for some of these chocolate malts, you've actually burned off quite a bit of the character, the enzymes that are present in the husk and in the malt.
Yeah, that's such an interesting that's such an interesting relationship, because all you're basically doing is applying heat and darkening these malts, and as you do that, the fact that you can no longer use that as your malt, your conversion malt, to convert those starches into sugars. What is the difference between a crystal malt and a roasted malt? It's not just the depth of color that you get, but there's
no, definitely not. So a crystal malt, or let's include caramel malts in that. Caramel malts are going to be kilned to a specific lava bond, and that's going to be almost always under 160 lava bond. 160 lava bond is about the darkest crystal malt I've ever seen. I think that's Simpson's extra dark crystal, or extra dark caramel. As we go lower, what happens is a lot of those mashing reactions that we rely on for the mash take place within the grain, and then they are halted. So we have crystal malts, which have a lot of those sugars already converted. They're ready in the grain. They're going to be extracted really quickly into the mash. With kilned, it undergoes some of those same Maillard reactions that do take place in roasted malts, but to a much lower lava bond. And then there's kind of this no man's land of lava bond. And it's usually, we consider it, Randy Mosher talks about this quite a bit, but it's usually considered to be between like 90 and 200-ish lava bond, that they're producing a lot of cigarette ash character and acrid character, things that we would associate, with like maybe not a great roasted malt, things we don't necessarily want a ton of in our beer. Although I do like a little bit, but as that says, like as that lava bond goes up during the roasting process, like with that intense heat and that as we go higher and higher in lava bond, and there's a very uniform distribution of that heat amongst the grains, that acrid character is actually burned away a bit. We don't see as much of those cigarette ash characters as we get into the 250 lava bond, the 260 lava bond. But that's also why you'll typically hear some of the, the conventional wisdom that lower lava bond roasted malts are stronger, or are more accurate than the higher lava bond roasted malts, because those characters are still closer to that no man's land, and they're going to still be more present. Yeah.
Well, it makes me think. So just to lay out a couple of different types of roasted grains, the one I'm thinking of now is pale chocolate, which I believe is roasted to about 200, 250.
Yeah, somewhere in there, and it's also a malt that I love.
Yeah, I do too. Well, and the thing about pale chocolate is that it is my Vienna lager. I've been I spent years trying to develop this really complex grain bill, and then one day figured I would just do 97% Vienna malt with 3% pale chocolate, and bingo. I mean, I nailed it. I love that.
Yes.
I love that recipe. But that just 3% pale chocolate in this batch of beer. You taste it. I'm telling you. And it is definitely there. It is so there to the point that I've considered dropping it down to 2%. But it's definitely there. I don't get ashy as much as I do like this really noticeable kind of like warm nuttiness from it. But then you compare something like pale chocolate, which is totally different than chocolate malt. Yep. Chocolate malt being roasted to about 350 to 400 love or something like that.
Yeah, some chocolate malts hit like 550. There is, usually when we talk about roasted malts or roasted grains, we tend to have like the same as crystal malts, where we have like some typical US production, typical UK production. But that's a weird distinction. Usually I'm just going to say it depends on the maltster. If that maltster happens to be in the UK versus the US, then fine. But, I wouldn't say it's necessarily directly traditional to a specific region, but depending on maltster, some like Simpson's chocolate malt is around, I think, 550 lava bond. It's much high. At the very least, it's much higher than something like a Brice chocolate. Right.
Which to me makes it like the delineation between chocolate malt and roasted barley, when you get to that point, because most roasted barleys that I'm aware of are between 500 and 600 love.
Yes.
So the main distinction there is whether or not the grain has been malted, and it makes me super curious. And here's an idea for a future experiment. What a beer that is, let's say a stout or something made with a dark roasted chocolate malt, how that might differ from one that's made with roasted barley that's around the same lava bond.
Yeah. Basically, like we talked about a little earlier, like as, what happens is pale malt is made, it goes through that germination process, it's dried, and then undergoes that process in a steel drum, right? That it goes through that intense heating process really short. Barley or roasted barley is made just with green barley, raw barley, put into that drum roaster and intensely heated and rotated until it's the appropriate lava bond.
I mean, that's basically how coffee is made.
Yes.
Yeah, that's such oh man, this is opening so many ideas for me talking about this with you right now. Another roasted grain, a roasted malt actually, that I think deserves some attention here is you had mentioned that a lot of that character that we get from these roasted malts comes from the husk being essentially burnt.
Yes.
But there are, there are certain styles that are, dark styles of beer like Schwarzbier or, a Munich Dunkel, that you don't want that ashy, stouty, portery character. You want a smooth roast character. And so, there are malts out there that have been dehusked.
Yes. And so we tend to call those, dehusked is definitely one word for it. We also I've seen debittered, which we'll typically see that for black malt, debittered black malt. And then the ExBEERiments specifically calls theirs special, which that's for their Carafa strain of malt, Carafa strain of malts, which is Carafa 1, 2, and 3,
Right.
and then Carafa Special 1, 2, and 3. And what that essentially means is that it's been dehusked.
I've never actually seen non-special Carafa.
Oh, really?
Yeah, all the craft I've ever used, and when I go, and maybe it's just because I'm looking for special, but it's almost always Carafa Special 2 or 3. I've never seen 1. I've never played with Carafa Special 1. But anyways, the dehusked. There's also Midnight Wheat. I know that a lot of people have been using lately because wheat is a huskless grain, and so that gets a little bit of love as well from the people who want a smoother, less bitter roast character.
Yep. And what that basically means, so wheat obviously without the husk isn't going to have as many of those in theory, it's the husk that contains a lot of those acrid and bitter characteristics that we associate with some darker malts. When it's dehusked, what happens is it's actually it's somewhat similar to rice polishing, but what happens is the husk gets worn down just via a polishing process, and it's rotated. We wear down the husk from the outside, and usually they leave some of the husk intact. Part of that is because you don't want to damage the kernel. You want to make sure that the rest of the grain is still intact, that all that's okay. But they leave, so there is a little bit of husk still, but that husk is worn down on the outside, and you're left with something that in theory doesn't have as many of those acrid and bitter potential for your mash.
Yeah, right. Whatever it is, I think what I've heard is that it's not necessarily what's in the grain husk. People get concerned with tannin extraction from husks and all that, but it's simply the fact that it's like if you burn a piece of paper, if you put a piece of raw paper on on your tongue, it just tastes like paper, but you burn that and it tastes like burnt paper. Right. And that was kind of the analogy that I heard years ago is that husk, when it gets so dark and burnt, that it really is, you're just tasting that burnt kind of thin husky thing going on. You remove that and you get all of that smooth malt character from the actual grain. So
yeah, definitely. And it makes a lot of sense. It's something that I see a lot of in styles like Scottish heavies or Scottish lights, where people are looking to add a little color. Like Schwarzbiers, like you said, Munich Dunkels. Like there's a lot of times where that's appropriate. I've even seen it being used in imperial stouts, where someone doesn't want like that imperial or that strong acrid character, but is still looking for the color and maybe a little bit of roastiness.
Yeah. Oh no, I made a porter one time that I think was upwards of like 12% Carafa Special too. And that was it. That's all I used. Awesome. No other roasted grains. And it came out great. Perceptibly, I didn't compare it to anything at the time, but, to my palate, it had that nice kind of smooth. I tend to perceive more of a dark chocolatey flavor from using high amounts of the dehusked malts.
Oh, sure.
Than I do when I'm using like roasted barley or black patent. I've got a little bit of experience using Gladfield malts. They have their dark grains. They sent me home with a bunch of dark grains from New Zealand last year, and those I don't think they're dehusked. They don't look like they are, but they do whatever they're doing. They again, it could be just the malt variety that the grain variety, the barley variety that they're using. But I also get like a really nice chocolatey thing from that. Whereas with other roasted barleys and chocolate malts, I do get more of that coffee thing. I can't remember the last time I actually perceived ashiness or like that, kind of acrid thing from a dark beer that I made, which I've kind of settled on my own anecdotal conclusion that that's probably more a function of process than it is ingredient, but I could be wrong.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, because we've seen some pretty incredible developments in the usage of roasted grain in terms of, people trying to mitigate some of those harsher roasted characters like ash or those bitterness. I've seen a wide range of people like just contributing this in different ways where, some like I know a couple others still use it in the mash for a lot of styles. But then we see a lot of different methods developing, like cold steeping, which we've done as an experiment.
Yep.
Adding those roasted grains at Vorlauf, just as a way to impart that color and some of those characteristics.
Right.
A wide range. Like it's been really interesting, like how different things have developed, not just ingredient wise, but process wise to mitigate some of that.
Absolutely, yeah. And, we've done a few experiments focused on roasted grains, some comparing different types and a couple comparing the methods that we discussed just now. All of these different methods for adding that those roasted grains to your beer. Results when we get back.
Compact and simple to use with a small footprint for brewing indoors, the Grainfather makes it easy for you to brew professional quality beers at home. The Grainfather is an all-in-one brewing system that lets you brew all grain beer in a single compact stainless steel unit. It uses an electric heating element and pump to maintain a constant temperature and to circulate the wort during the mashing and cooling stages. It also comes with a counterflow chiller to reduce chilling times and produce high quality wort. And now, with the addition of their conical fermenter, the Grainfather takes things one step further by offering homebrewers state-of-the-art temperature-controlled fermentation just like commercial breweries use. And with the Grainfather Recipe Creator and Connect app, you can easily design a recipe, sync your brewing system with your phone, and then just sit back and relax as the app takes over and assures that you maintain your scheduled mash temps and boil schedule. Head to Grainfather.com to purchase your all-in-one brewing system today and to sign up for their free recipe creator tool. Once more, head on over to Grainfather.com, that's Grainfather.com, and get started today.
When dumping wort-soaked grain and leftover low-gravity wort while cleaning up after a brew day, did you ever wonder what your true efficiency would be if that wort made its way to the kettle instead? Using the brew bag, a fabric filter for all mash tuns and brewing methods, allows you to capture every last drop of wort. Not only does this increase kettle efficiency, it lowers your grain bill, which saves you money. Throwing wort in the trash is like dumping a 12-pack down the drain and just doesn't make sense. Use the brew bag and leave no wort behind. I've been using these filters for a long time and recommend them to everyone. I never have to worry about a stuck sparge and cleanup is fast and easy. Go grab yourself a brew bag fabric filter at brewinabag.com and be sure to use code TBP17 at checkout to get a discount on your order. With so many types of roasted grain available, we set forth to test the belief that many hold that certain ones are better for particular styles due to the unique flavors they impart. And our first experiment focused on the difference between roasted barley and black patent. So roasted barley being unmalted, it's definitely different than black patent, which is actually malted before it's roasted. Roasted barley is largely believed, I think, at least in the people that I talk to about these grains, it's believed to impart a somewhat smoother roasted character with coffee flavors, while black patent is believed to lend kind of more of a burnt, ashy flavor. I remember one time I was building a porter recipe. This was a long time ago. And a buddy of mine was like, dude, you got to drop the black patent unless you want it to taste like a cigarette ash. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, black patent gets a lot of hate in the homebrew world, I think. Like I very rarely see people recommending it. Usually people are, if they are mentioning it, they're saying how strong it is and how you definitely don't want to have as much as you would of something like chocolate or roasted barley. And like considering roasted barley, the trademark of roasted barley is Guinness.
Yeah.
It very famously uses a large percentage of just roasted barley as its roasted malt. And I think people associate some of that smoothness that Guinness has with roasted barley in general. So those expectations are pretty well established.
Right. Well, and I think the fact that Guinness uses roasted barley and that it's so well known that they use roasted barley for their stout, I think that kind of has influenced this idea that, roasted barley should be reserved for stout and black patent should be reserved for porter. Right. Obviously nowadays breweries and home brewers are using blends of the two and all of this stuff. But I'd certainly adopted this idea. I mean, after I remember very specifically thinking I cannot use black patent because it's going to make my beer taste like an ashtray. So I stuck with brewing stout and porter, using, roasted barley and black patent respectively. And black patent was always used very, very deftly, like little sprinkle it in, kind of blow over my black patent malt into my mash. And that was good enough for me.
Yeah, I think most people would probably share that experience.
Right. Well, curious to see if how much these two malts differed. I designed an experiment where I made two porters. Both of them had 9% of roasted grain. One got all roasted barley, the other one got all black patent, and they were treated exactly the same otherwise. Now, because of the impact that these darker roasted grains had or are known to have on the mash pH, I did take some pH readings and found that during about 10 minutes into the mash, the roasted barley version was at about 5.34, which was my plan, and the black patent one was at 5.2. So it did seem to pull that pH down a little bit and kind of impart more of an acidic thing to the mash at the very least, which I thought was pretty interesting. Kind of confirmed in my head the idea that the black patent might actually lend more harsh flavors, only because maybe people are perceiving more of an acidic thing going on. I don't know.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I mean, it would definitely be what we expect from those pH adjustments based on just, naturally the higher lava bond of black patent versus roasted barley. We would traditionally expect it to have more of a pH impact.
Yeah, sure. Well, and I'll be honest, if the black patent had come in at like 5.7, then I'd be saying that I would expect that to extract tannins, and that's where the harsher flavors are coming from. So, confirmation bias is a real thing. So when the worts were done being boiled and all that fun stuff, I checked the OG of both of the beers, both of the worts, and roasted barley came in at 1053, and the black patent one came in at 1055. Again, not terribly surprising to me given the fact that roasted barley is unmalted. The black patent is a malted product, and so for it to have 0.002 specific gravity points more than the roasted barley one didn't surprise me too much. The worts looked really similar, and I did notice that, these beers were both pitched with the same amount of yeast and fermented right next to each other in the same firm chamber, all that stuff. As they were fermenting, I did notice that the Kreuzen on the roasted barley beer, I believe, was slightly darker than the Kreuzen on the black patent beer, but otherwise, they fermented the same and everything about them was similar. So when they were done, I served these to 26 different participants, which would require 14 of them to be able to identify the unique sample in order for us to say that there was a reliable, the beers were reliably distinguishable, a significant difference between these two. In the end, now I can tell you my impression of these beers was that they were exactly the same. I'll give you, I did multiple triangle tests and I couldn't tell these things apart. Which, as someone who had convinced myself how different black patent and roasted barley are, I was pretty surprised by this, but I was more curious how a panel of blind tasters would do it. And in the end, only 10 people out of 26 correctly guessed the different beer, and most of them told me straight up that it was just a guess. So not quite, just a bump over a third of the people were able to get it right. We needed 14, only got 10. So this one got me. I know we say we're surprised a lot, but this one I was fully expecting to have one ashtray beer, and one normal stout.
Yeah, I agree. At the very least, let's not even say that it would necessarily be ashtray. Let's just say that they were different. I mean, that, roasted barley versus black patent, that's definitely something I would expect to come back different. Maybe even if preference was split, or if perception was split just based on how people thought about the beers. I would really expect these to be different.
Yeah.
And so the fact that it came back this way, we can jump to any number of conclusions about why that is, but honestly, reliably in the end, what I see from this is that both malts or both, let's say, grains, roasted barley, but both grains are equal in opportunity to be used in a porter. It definitely helps me think a little bit more about black patent and thinking about maybe it's not like the acrid nightmare that we've been sold that it is.
Yeah. I mean, for me, that's not even a maybe at this point, because I was the one who had I got to drink these beers, and they were both really good stouts. I'm gonna laud myself on that one. They were really good. One of the contentions that we got when we shared these results was, well, you only use 9% roasted grain, in the back. I don't know about you, but 9% is pretty high.
Especially you have a 1050, 1055 OG beer here. I see 9% roasted barley and imperial stouts.
Yeah.
Granted, I've seen up to 20. I've seen a ton of roasted grains in imperial stouts, but this is a 1055 OG beer. It just, man.
I know. I'm in the same boat. Another on the opposite end of the argument as to why we didn't notice a difference was people saying you used too much. That if we used 4% or 5%, that subtlety is where those differences can be found. And that's something we'll have to look into a little bit later. But yeah, interesting results nonetheless. So now I'm curious about how all of these different roasted grains compare to each other. I designed a second experiment to compare this dehusked Carafa Special 2 to a standard roasted chocolate malt. Now, again, I believe these two were around the same love bond. I think Special 2 is somewhere in the 400 to 450 love range.
Okay.
And that was the chocolate malt that I got as well. I did that on purpose. They were both purchased at the same time, so they had the similar, freshness and all of this. More than a few times I've designed a recipe only to realize I don't have the exact roasted grain it calls for. So I substitute it with something close. And these are malts that I would substitute for each other often. Again, Carafa Special 2 is dehusked and generally used to impart a roasted character without any of the acrid characteristics you get from other roasted grains. Perfect for smoother lager styles like Schwarzbier, right? Whereas chocolate malt is a commonly roasted grain that's not quite as dark as black patent or roasted barley. It's generally in that 300, 350 love range, maybe a little bit darker. I've never really noticed much of a chocolate character. I don't know why they call it chocolate malt.
Yeah, it's a bit of a misnomer that usually at least for me from chocolate malt, I usually get something like I get some coffee characteristics. I get a little bit, obviously I get some roasted character, I get some bitterness from it. But yeah, I can't say chocolate is one of the things I get. And so don't get me wrong, I actually love chocolate malt. I use a lot of chocolate malt in my Imperial Stout. I think it's like 7%. Chocolate malt is used really, really widely in commercial Imperial Stouts and just stouts in general. Yeah. So it's nothing against chocolate malt, but it is definitely not named appropriately.
Yeah. Maybe it's just because of the color. That's what I've come to. But so for this experiment to compare Carafa Special 2 with chocolate malt, I figured what better style to make than a Schwarzbier, and my expectation, was that if I'm making a Schwarzbier with chocolate malt, I should get a little bit more of that roasted, maybe a little bit more of that acrid thing going on as opposed to this dehusked malt.
Yeah, so I would for sure assume it looks like, for these recipes, you used about like 6.5% roasted malt in total. And at that percentage in this beer, like a Schwarzbier especially, I would for sure expect chocolate malt to be, much more present, much more expressive, with Carafa Special, being maybe a little more subdued, like maybe more appropriate for the style because it'd be less in your face.
Well, you think of Schwarzbier and a lot of people, when they describe Schwarzbier, it's like, it's a Pilsner that just looks dark. I don't think a proper Schwarzbier tastes like a Pilsner that looks dark, but it definitely has those Pilsner characteristics, and the roasted character gets out of the way, but it's there in the background. To me, it plays a supporting role, and it's one of the things I love about Schwarzbier so much. Yeah. I was with you. I expected the chocolate malt beer or version of this Schwarzbier to be a bit more porter-like or stout-like. So I made these beers and did all the same measurements that I did in the last experiment. Mash pH, OG, and FG all ended up being exactly the same. So that was cool. No differences there. And in terms of appearance, when the beers were finished, the chocolate malt version did seem ever so slightly paler than the Carafa Special 2 beer, but they were close enough to where, maybe it could have been lighting type of thing. Mm-hmm. I took the finished beers and I served them to 24 participants. We would require 13 of those 24 to accurately identify the unique sample in order for us to say they were different or reliably distinguishable. And only 10 people were able to tell them apart. So these beers tasted more alike than they did different.
Yeah, and that is, this one, so the roasted barley, black patent, both of those have the husk. We it's 9%. Like there's a lot of reasons we think like, oh, well, maybe this is why they were similar. But Carafa Special 2 and chocolate malt in my mind are further apart than roasted barley and black patent are, even though they're both malted. They're both, actual malts. So it blows me away. Like I know you're right. We say that all the time, but this is definitely one I expected to be a lot more different. And what was really interesting to me was your own or not your own preference, but your own perception of this beer. That it looks like you were right in your own blind triangle tests about half the time, which is about what we would expect from beers that aren't that different.
No, yeah, I couldn't tell these beers apart, man. I did 6 official, like informal triangle attempts, and I got 3 out of 6 right. But they were just random guesses. Again, I was really pleased with these beers. People are going to ask, so do you just use chocolate malt for your Schwartz beer now? I have, and it's good. And Carafa Special too. They go through a lot of work, to dehusk that malt, and it seems like they would only do that if it mattered. And I know that this is just one experiment, but the husk on the chocolate malt that I used didn't seem to impart any bad flavors to me.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, right? That this is a single trial. We're talking about this beer in this context with this yeast, all those things. But it also doesn't necessarily discount that people couldn't tell. And so I think ultimately I would love to talk a little more with the people who suggested that maybe it's the kind of chocolate malt, just because that would be an experiment I'd like to see too, where we talk about, maybe a chocolate malt that's a little lighter in lava bond versus a chocolate malt that's a little darker. All these things are produced with different levels of moisture, different heats, different intensities, different times. So for sure, I understand that argument, but I'd be hard pressed to say that they're different enough that people wouldn't tell. So I want to see more of this one.
Yeah, you and me both, my friend. Well, there's a certain yeast out there that I've been using a little bit lately, and I think you've used it as well, that I think would make a really fantastic dark ale, like a stout. And that's Imperial Yeast's A31 Tartan. It's a really I think it's the McEwen's strain.
It is, yeah.
But that's a fantastic yeast. And I just, we've been using Imperial yeast pretty extensively over the last year or so. Every pitch right pouch of Imperial yeast contains 200 billion cells of the purest yeast ready to turn your wort into delicious beer. I'm a big fan of so many of their strains. L13 Global, that's one of their, kind of all-around lager yeast strains that I found works great at even warmer temperatures. Of course, they've got A07 Flagship for your super clean American-style ales and A38 Juice for those hazy New England IPAs. Loving Imperial and everything they have to offer. We're going to be with them at HomebrewCon as well. They're a great sponsor of the podcast. Send them some love. Check them out at imperialyeast.com, and you can pick up their product at both More Beer and Great Fermentations. Okay, we've talked a little bit about these ingredient comparisons, but there's also some process stuff when it comes to using roasted grains and getting them into your beer that a lot, I think is gotten a little bit more focused. Ways to impart that roasted character, maybe without getting the acridness that you'd expect from a grain like Black Patent.
Yeah, definitely. Like we talked about a little earlier, people are finding really inventive ways to get some of those dark malt contributions or dark grain contributions without, hoping to extract a lot of that acrid or bitter character that we find either in the husk or just in the malt. So I've seen a lot of really great ways people are doing this, and, true Brewlosophy fashion, we put some of these to the test. It was actually, I think the first one ever was a full mash of dark grains versus capped at Vorloff. Right. And I think you did this one. And basically what that means is in this rye stout that you made, this was a comparison of the grain of about 12% roasted barley. So quite a bit of roasted barley that was added, just, milled with the rest of the grains, added to the mashed for the full 60 minutes versus that same weight of roasted barley milled and added during the last 10 minutes during a Vorloff of the batch.
Right. So what I did with this one is one batch was all of the grains in all of the grist, right, that I designed the recipe for. The other one, I just withheld the roasted barley, milled it on its own, and sprinkled it over the top of my mash during the Vorloff, the last 10 minutes of the mash for a batch sparge batch. Yeah, the idea here, now this is something that my understanding is this is something that Gordon Strong really talked up in.
He's talked about this a lot in Brewing Better Beer.
And this, I've spoke with him about this. I know Malcolm has talked with him about this. The idea is that given the impact that roasted barley has on mash pH, by withholding it, you're able to hit that pH and get the conversion and all of that stuff that you want, as well as that smoother roasted malt character by adding your roasted grains at the end of the mash. So they're not sitting in the mash the entire time, impacted by the pH and all of the other stuff that's happening during the mash. So this was one, I had used this technique quite a few times, again, just based on kind of appeal to authority, this idea that people are saying that it imparts a smoother roasted character. Like you said, 12% of the grist in either of these was the roasted barley. So a pretty big charge of roasted barley, 1 pound for a 5-gallon batch. Let's see. Obviously, I was going to take the mash pH because I thought that would be interesting. So for the full mash one, the one that had the roasted barley in it, the mash pH was 5.0. That's pretty low.
Yeah, that's much lower than I would expect.
Right, yeah. But it makes sense. You got a full pound of roasted barley. We know that that kind of pulls that pH down. The mash pH of the one that didn't have the roasted grains in it yet, at least, was 5.3, which is exactly what I planned. So it's doing what we expect it to do at this point. Both worts hit a similar OG. However, the full mash beer did attenuate slightly less. 1012 FG compared to the capped mash at about 1010 FG. I thought that was kind of interesting.
That is really interesting. Yeah, that's definitely interesting. I'm not really sure what would be going on there, especially though it may just be a function of the pH. Like actually fermentation is great at buffering pH, and like a lot of beers will end up around a similar pH with different starting ones, which we've seen in some other experiments, but it could just be a function of that. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah, for sure. Well, as far as appearance goes, the capped mash beer was slightly lighter than the full mash beer. To me, that kind of made sense. I guess I sort of expected that just because you're not extracting as many of those color compounds. Just because by virtue of the fact that those grains aren't in the water as long, right? Weren't in the mash.
Which makes it makes total sense. That it's not too surprising, and it's honestly almost more surprising that they had a similar OG than
I know
than that. But yeah,
this color difference, if you're not extracting as many of those color contributors, then perhaps you're not extracting certain flavor contributors as well. So I, kind of primed me for a difference here. Exactly. I served these beers to 22 participants. We would need 11 so exactly half to identify the unique sample in the triangle test in order for us to say that they were significantly different, and exactly 11 did. So we could say, from a statistical perspective, that these beers were different, that this process difference imparted a unique flavor for either one. Now something I want to say is that in a conversation with Gordon Strong following publication of these results, he did mention that this capping the mash thing was originally intended for fly sparge setups, right? And I didn't do that. I did a batch sparge setup. So I added the full sparge volume of water to my cooler at the time and let that sit before running off, as opposed to sprinkling water over the top of my mash. Just makes me wonder how the results might have been even more different, or if they weren't, had I not done batch sparge. Something to keep in mind. But people were curious about the pH of these finished beers, given the difference that was in the mash. So I did take some readings after the fact and found that they came much closer to each other. Like you said, Matt, fermentation is an incredible equalizer.
Yes, very much so.
The full mash beer was at 4.16 pH, while the capped mash beer was at 4.19. So it did its job. Fermentation did. I wouldn't say that either tasted any more, acidic than the other one. But in my own triangle test, I did 4. I got 3 out of the 4 right. I perceived the full mash beer, the beer that had all of the roasted grains mashed with it, as being slightly fuller bodied and rounder in flavor, while the capped mash beer had what I perceived to be a slight, I don't know if it was really astringency, but that's kind of how I perceived it. So yeah, they were different.
Yeah, that one, like, it's one of those ones that's like great because going in, you're kind of like, okay, I think that it's always great when something validates the assumption you have. Right. We spend so much time being surprised. So it's great doing that. And I think it makes a ton of sense, especially for the mitigation of the mash pH, because that's something that, like a lot of people, especially brewing beers with higher percentages of roasted grains, like, 12% roasted barley, for example, that controlling the mash pH and your water's ability to buffer the mash pH, like it's definitely something that people pay attention to. Yeah. And it sounds like it's definitely an option.
Yeah. Well, and I think the fact that, at least to my perception, and we don't ask too much about what tasters perceived as being different. We just ask them if they, which one is different, is that I perceived the capped mash version of this porter to be the one that wasn't as smooth and rounded. So kind of opposite of my expectations. I expected
Really?
it. Yeah. That was the, I put astringency. That's kind of how I perceived it, though I'm not necessarily sure if that's what it is. But to me, the full mash beer, the one that got all of those grains added into the mash, that was the one that I liked a little bit more. It was fuller bodied. It had more of the porter flavor that I expect. So who knows? This is one that we're going to have to look into a little bit more. But another process another method that brewers are using for imparting roasted character into their beers is cold steeping.
Yeah, so cold steeping is a pretty interesting technique where, most of the time when we talk about mashing or we talk about extraction, we're doing that at mash temperatures. Like we're doing that some, different rest levels, but usually in the sack rest range where we're at like 146 to like 154, something along those lines, degrees Fahrenheit. Cold steeping is a method that in theory is meant to only extract mostly color and maybe a little bit of flavor compounds from grains while leaving a lot of that acrid and bitter character in the malt. Like that, you're going to get a smoother roast character with, like some fuller roasted flavors without any of that ashy characteristic.
Right. Another similarity to coffee. I mean, there's cold steeping coffee right now is like
it's the big thing.
Super popular in Berkeley and stuff.
Oh yeah, definitely. It's gaining popularity for sure.
But the thing is, I'll be honest with you. I love cold steeped. I love coffee, but I love cold steeped coffee. I perceive what I think is a difference between that and a normal drip coffee or a pour over or whatever. So to me, just kind of relating this to coffee, I've never done cold steeping of roasted grains. I don't brew that many roasted beers or dark beers, but I definitely would expect there to be a difference between these ones, just given what I've experienced with coffee, which is like the cousin of roasted barley.
Yeah, same. Yeah, going into this, so this one I actually did was cold steeping grains versus a full mash like you did previously in an American porter. And going into this, I thought pretty much exactly the same thing, that I think this is going to be different. So basically, I used a total percent of 8% roasted malt. It was a blend of black patent and pale chocolate, which is pretty standard for me in my porter recipe. And I ended up using about 2 quarts of water to steep 1 pound of that roasted grain in. So I milled the grain and boiled that water previously just to make sure that it was, good and sanitary, added it to a sanitized vessel. And then once it had cooled to room temperature, I steeped the grains for about 24 hours or 48 hours. And there was I saw some pretty rapid color extraction. It definitely improved, got darker as time went on. And on brew day, I weighed out that same amount of roasted grain, milled it with the rest of my grains, and did a full mash with it. And sort of similar to the full versus Cab Vorloff experiment, we ended up with a different mash pH, which is what we'd about expect. That full mash that had all those roasted grains included to it actually hit my intended mash pH of about 5.2, while the cold steep batch that didn't have any of the roasted grains in it was at 5.31. So a pretty significant difference as far as mash pH goes.
But also not unexpected. I mean, they didn't have any roasted grains in it, right? I mean,
yeah, exactly. It's
right.
Not at all unexpected. It was definitely something that we could have seen coming, or that we did see coming.
Right.
So after that, I removed my grains, went through the boil and the bittering process as normal, which you would expect possibly different bitterness contributions from the hops based on different pH. And then during the last 10 minutes of the boil, I added that cold steeped liquid once the grains had been separated from it to the batch that didn't have any roasted grains in it.
Right.
Finished out the boil, did my chill. Post boil, both batches actually had the same OG. Which was really interesting to me. Mm-hmm. I had a total of 23 people participate in this experiment, which we would have needed about 12 people to get significance, to say they were reliably different. In the end, 13 people got this one right. Mm-hmm. So we were able to say that with this beer, reliably out of the sample size, people were able to distinguish a beer made with a cold steeping method versus a full mash method.
Awesome. So the method does impart a difference. Again, we don't ask participants on our survey, what it was about the beers that they perceived as being different. But Matt, how did you perform on this? What did you think about these beers?
Well, so I mean, we blind triangle ourselves on all of these, and out of 5 blind triangles, I got it right 4 times, which is, I was fairly confident in this. I wasn't dead on, but I was fairly confident, and I saw, to me, the cold steep beer was actually pretty much exactly what you would expect from this method, where it was a little bit smoother, definitely less roasted grain presence just overall. It definitely did not have the same amount of roasted contribution, not even just the bitter acrid characters, but flavor overall, some of the pleasant things that I expect from Black Patent and Pale Chocolate.
Right.
It was definitely a little sweeter. And overall, like I enjoyed both beers a lot. I kicked both those kegs, but overall, it was kind of what I expected. And I think there's a couple reasons for that. One of which is when we talk about cold steeping, something we see very frequently regarding that process is people sometimes will use double or even triple the amount of roasted grain they would typically use for a recipe for the cold steep, as a way of just trying to get more of that character, because obviously without that hot, without the mash at regular mash temps, you're not going to get necessarily as much from it.
Yeah.
So people will double or triple that roasted grain. We didn't for this experiment, just as a way of comparing just the method without saying like, okay, well, of course, if you use double the amount of roasted grain, it's going to be different.
Well, but that seems like you're trying to compensate for what you lose by not doing a full mash in some way.
Sure.
I mean, we're nerds. I sit here, we talk about these 4 experiments that we've already talked about a million times, and I still kind of get off on it. Like, it's fun for me. But
Absolutely.
it also, we're after we talk about these, we try to go into like, well, how did it impact, your thinking or your approach or whatever? And the kind of the psychologist in me can't help but wonder with something like this. You said that you didn't get in the cold steep beer what you expect from a porter, right? And I can't help but wonder, well, if cold steeping was the norm, if that's how people had been doing it for centuries, then perhaps that would be what we expect, and so that including those grains in the full mash would be kind of like, well, it added these flavors. It was, it was more palate. It didn't have, and it's just so funny to me because I guarantee you there are people out there who would say that they preferred the cold steeping beer, over the one that included all the grains in the mash. In fact, what were the preference ratings on these ones when we asked participants about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so these ones were fairly split on preference for these, and I got to admit, like I said, I enjoyed both these beers a lot, and I think it's really comes down to like some people want that acrid bitter character, but other people like really just are in it for a sweet, smooth beer. So
yeah,
it makes total sense to me that these are defined by just personal preference. I think that there's a lot of room for all of these methods and both these methods just based on the beer you're trying to make.
Right. Yeah. Do what works best for you. And Matt, what is that? Are you going to be cold steeping in the future?
Man, I'm totally going to be cold steeping in the future. It is going to, I'm so excited about like these different roasted grain methods. Like if I want to make a really sweet, maybe chocolatey porter, like if I'm going to throw cocoa nibs in it, I might just do cold steeping to try to get a little bit less of the acrid character, which is what I perceived in these beers. But my big, the Imperial Stout I made yesterday, I'm mashing all of it. I want some of those bitter characters to come across. I want to have a little bit of that. So
right.
I'm not sold like, oh, for 100%, I'm going to cold steep, 100% I'm going to full mash. I am so excited just to have another tool in the toolbox and to keep exploring these methods.
Yeah, for sure, man. I'm right there with you. When I make a roasted or dark ale in particular, so a stout, a porter, a brown ale, I fully expect there to be that full mashed character, if we'll call it something. And so I'm not going to be capping the mash or cold steeping, which I've never done. I should try it at some point.
Yeah, you're missing out.
And to me, what all of this means is just that different roasted grains may be less different than we believed, while these different methods that we use seem to really do have the impact that maybe the people who kind of invented these ideas intended, and that you can use what works best for you, and that's what we recommend. These are single data points, and we encourage anyone else to go out there and try it out for themselves, and see what they think. So, that's about all I've got on roasted grains. Matt, you got anything else?
Man, I have so much more, but I think we'll set it for another time. I can't wait to keep exploring these methods. This is a place near near and dear to my heart. So
Right on, brother. Me too. Well, to read more about these experiments and all of the other wacky stuff we're up to, you can head over to brewlosophy.com. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey cause it soothes my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more.